The infamous Queen Cleopatra, produced by Netflix, is out and available for streaming. We need to talk about this miniseries. As you know, right after the trailer for Queen Cleopatra became public, Netflix immediately received all kinds of accusations, including falsification of history and cultural appropriation. Egyptians even started a petition to cancel the show. There's a lot to unpack here, but I'll try to be reasonably short, so I'm not gonna dissect all of the possible subjects linked with this particular depiction of Cleopatra and point out all of the inaccuracies in this miniseries, only the most interesting ones. And there are lots of them. I've been taking notes while watching the 4 episodes of this documentary, and I've noticed that I have to pause the video like every 10 seconds. I mean, yeah, this is bad. The amount of nonsense and outright lies in this pseudo-documentary is quite sizable, especially in the first and in the last episode. It is quite painful to watch, and not only because of the questionable casting decisions. Oh no, it's mostly the script. This miniseries, in fact, is a successor of the Roman Empire. That's the name of the Netflix show, Roman Empire. 3 seasons. Each season is more or less a different show. Season 1 is about Julius Caesar, then season 2 is about Gaius Caligula, and the last one is about Commodus. All of them are docudramas, as they call it. Needless to say, this Roman Empire series is problematic, but since they didn't cast black actor as Julius Caesar, it received much less attention back in the day. But yeah, Gaius Caligula sleeps with his 3 sisters, Commodus kills countless people in the arena, stuff like that. Queen Cleopatra is marketed as a separate miniseries, but it has absolutely the same delivery, structure, and style. It is just season 4, essentially. It is not something entirely new, and we must remember that. Okay, we're gonna start with the 2 main subjects of Queen Cleopatra, the focus of the series. And then we'll gradually move to probably more interesting topics, although a bit less visible and less outrageous. And these 2 main ideas, core ideas of the miniseries, are obviously black people and feminism. So there's gonna be 3 main parts in the video: blackwashing, feminism, and politics. Let's go. Blackwashing. The situation with Queen Cleopatra is obviously quite different from this trend of blackwashing history when suddenly queens of England are played by black actresses. Because when we're dealing with the work of fiction, one can make an argument about artistic freedom. This argument has some substance, which leaves some room for debate. For example, when Troy Fall of a City miniseries, co-produced by BBC and Netflix, casts black actors as Achilles, Patroclus, Zeus, etc., well, it's mythological material, and people played with this material a lot, even in ancient Greece. Euripides theoretically could cast a black actor or any kind of actor as a Greek hero if he felt it could benefit the plot or deliver a certain message. He was exactly that kind of person. And yes, there's nothing inherently wrong with casting a black actor as Zeus. Achilles, on the other hand, is problematic, but that's a different subject. So, if I'm personally not a fan of this approach, and especially of the motives of the filmmakers, there can be a discussion. But the Queen Cleopatra miniseries is marketed as a documentary. That's it. You don't really have this creative freedom argument. I'm okay with historical revisionism because it is a good thing. Some people don't understand that. But there's a difference between presenting plausible theories based on data, source criticism, and common sense, and straight up imagining things because of your political agenda. And they are imagining things. They actually say this on camera. Here are some quotes from Queen Cleopatra for you. The appeal of Cleopatra is that we imagine her, that everyone can imagine her in their own way. Really? I imagine Obama as a white woman. How do you like them apples? I imagine Hitler is a 5-year-old black girl. I mean, seriously, this is a documentary. You cannot say this kind of stuff. It either means you're out of your mind or you're desperately trying to squeeze your weird agenda at any cost. Both things can be true at the same time. But this is probably the core argument for this infamous casting decision. There are some other arguments, which include we don't know her exact racial heritage. Ancient Egyptians would have had a variety of different complexions, as we find in other African cultures today. Given that Cleopatra represents herself as an Egyptian, it seems very strange that we insist on depicting her as a wholly European. I want people to know the story of Cleopatra because she was an African queen. And that's a fact that's been buried, it's been erased, it's been whitewashed. First of all, we know that Cleopatra was a Macedonian. I made a dramatic pause to attract the attention of our Greek viewers. They usually get triggered when they hear the word Macedonia, and then they start shouting that Macedonians were Greeks. It is safe to say that by the time of Cleopatra, they were indeed. So yeah, Cleopatra was Greek, or Greco-Macedonian. But that's true, we don't really know what she looked like. There are certain statues that are attributed as probably depicting Cleopatra, but we are not 100% sure. Maybe it's Cleopatra, at least one of them, or maybe not. It is not a situation when we know for a fact that, for example, this is Marcus Aurelius and this is Septimius Severus. We can be 100% sure with Cleopatra. Then we have coins, but it is kind of hard to reconstruct her likeness from coins. But even if we don't know how she looked like, but we have an idea, this doesn't mean she was black, whatever it means. I had a video that touches on that subject, a video about Septimius Severus, our favorite black emperor. Black is a strange category which changes meaning depending on the context, just like this white category. It is mostly a very American thing and a subproduct of a segregated society. But yeah, you cannot hire a British biracial actress to play the part of Cleopatra in a documentary, because Macedonians were, well, Mediterranean people. Now, we know that the Ptolemaic dynasty was Greco-Macedonian, but there is a question of Cleopatra's mother, at least in this miniseries. We don't know who Cleopatra's mother was. It's possible that her mother was an Egyptian. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that her mother was an Egyptian. But it is also possible that I'm an Egyptian myself. But probably not.
In Valencia, I saw the Holy Grail. Well, maybe, right? It's possibly the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, but probably not.
They don't really mention explicitly that Ptolemaic Egypt was a divided society. So this hypothetical ethnic Egyptian ancestry is highly unlikely. And Egyptians were not really black, but let's stay on the subject. I know that this is the moment when many of you will say, come on, why are we discussing this nonsense about her mother and impossible Egyptians, when everybody knows that Cleopatra was a product of extensive inbreeding? Well, yeah, that's the dominant theory. And it is probably true. But there are certain details here, and obviously the showrunners don't pay attention to them, even though it could be their, way out in presenting the blackwashed Cleopatra. That could add a certain depth to their claim. Yes, it is believed that the Ptolemaic dynasty practiced brotherly love since Ptolemy II, who literally had the epithet Philadelphus. How real and, for example, not purely ceremonial these marriages were in every generation, and the dynasty ruled for almost 3 centuries. is one hell of a question. Indeed, we don't know who exactly was Cleopatra's mother, but we kind of know at the same time. It becomes complicated, especially given the fact that everyone in the Ptolemaic dynasty was more or less either Ptolemy or Cleopatra. Well, yeah, and Arsinoe and Berenice. But that's not the point. The ancients never assigned numbers to rulers and members of nobility. This is a modern practice. And all of this gets a bit messy sometimes. Our Cleopatra is usually assigned the number 7, but it can be a different number, and we don't know if her mother was Cleopatra number 6 or number 5. This is something that was never mentioned in this documentary, but they should have. This is important. Essentially, both Ptolemy and Cleopatra became ceremonial titles at that point, just like Caesar and Augustus became titles later. The pharaoh is always Ptolemy. His wife is naturally Cleopatra. If the sources are not good, and they are not, it can easily create troubles for a scholar going through the records. King and queen gave birth to king, queen, king, another guy, princess, and somebody else. If you marry a pharaoh, will you become his sister? The screenwriters for the series mentioned that the first husband brother of Cleopatra was Ptolemy the 13th. But then she had another husband brother, and his name was also Ptolemy, this time number 14. They say this in the documentary, but they don't see the self-evident problem here. The problem that calls for at least some explanation. Ptolemy the 12th had two sons, Ptolemy and Ptolemy. Cleopatra's son was also Ptolemy Caesar to be precise. Of course he was Ptolemy, the name is synonymous with Pharaoh. The screenwriters and the experts, it seems, don't know about that. They claim that his name was Caesarion. But in fact, it was a nickname, like Caligula or Caracalla. Anyway, back to Cleopatra. Even if we don't know 100% who her mother was, and we don't know 100% exactly how she looked like, we can say with 99.9 probability that she was a Greek, and with 100% probability that she had a Mediterranean complexion. The creators of the miniseries state that they wanted a black queen, which is a hilarious statement in itself. But if you want to make a film about a black queen, why don't you just make a film about a black queen? They existed. Of course, you have to define black first. I mean, if you're making, say, a movie about a queen from a Nubian dynasty, her skin pigmentation is gonna be quite dark. But she won't be an African American woman, because African Americans are not related to Nubians, neither culturally nor ethnically. I'm gonna finish this segment with this legendary quote from the trailer.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
You might think that this is some random guest saying stuff, but this woman, Shelley P. Haley, is a professor at Hamilton College. What happened to education in the United States? It's a rhetorical question. I mean, I agree that sometimes you should ignore what they tell you in school, because books for children are indoctrination tools that frequently spread lies. But not like this, not in a documentary. By the way, in the episode 4 of the miniseries, this Hamilton College professor tells us the story that she had a vision of Cleopatra in a dream, who said, "You have to tell my story." Feminism. Okay, we're finally done with skin color. Now, women empowerment. I know all about it. In fact, my mother is a woman, which genetically makes me 50% woman. That's how science works. Probably. Here we go with some quotes from our documentary. This is a woman exercising power. There was a time, a long time ago, when women ruled with unparalleled power. They bowed to no man. And so on. There's more. Well, this is a completely invented narrative. I mean, Queen Elizabeth II died like yesterday. What about Queen Victoria? And what about other British queens? You don't like British monarchs? Okay, Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia. Let's all make a shining beacon of feminism out of her. What's this? What are you trying to say? Where is logic? Then we have this comparison of women in Egypt and women in Rome. And yes, they try to portray Romans as evil idiots through all of the 4 episodes of the miniseries, which is a separate problem. Egypt's women had almost equal rights to men under the law. Women could choose who they married, they chose who they divorced, they could start businesses, they kept their own property. Women in Rome were supposed to stay at home. Well, that's an oversimplification and juggling with facts to prove some weird point. As we already said, Ptolemaic Egypt was a divided society, and Cleopatra obviously was a part of the Greco-Macedonian nobility. Greek women legally had a male guardian, but that's a whole different subject. They actually choose to ignore this Greek/Egyptian division. Remember this quote that Cleopatra represents herself as an Egyptian, or that she was an African queen. She was a Greek queen, and that's very important. We'll talk about it some more a little bit later. Now, through all of the miniseries, they imply not only that Romans were evil, but also that people hated Cleopatra for being a woman and a female ruler, especially Romans, obviously. One of the experts on the show literally says that Rome was against the idea of a woman being a ruler. It's that simple. Indeed, Rome was against this idea, but they also were against monarchy. And the problems with Cleopatra for some of the politicians and for a certain part of the general public were not stemmed from the fact that there is a country in the world where women can hold the highest office. It was mostly about the involvement of Egypt in the politics of Rome. The show had some episodes when Romans refused to take orders from a woman. But in fact, it wasn't about her gender, more like about her being a foreign monarch, even if she was an allied monarch. That doesn't matter. But yeah, let's present everything as misogyny. Octavian refuses to surrender because Cleopatra is a woman. Everyone who does something that Cleopatra doesn't like, well, does this because she's a woman. Yeah, sure. Also, over the years, there were instances when Roman soldiers were switching sides and becoming subjects of the Egyptian monarch. They had no problem with Cleopatra's gender. They repeat over and over again how Augustus started to spread weird propaganda about how Cleopatra seduced a couple of good Romans, she's some kind of a sorceress, etc. Maybe he did, but he used a propaganda machine against the hostile foreign leader, just like everybody else up to this day. This propaganda can be absolutely nonsensical, but that's just what politicians do. Actually, the depiction of Augustus in the miniseries is overwhelmingly negative. And towards the end of the series, in the last episode, we have an absolutely hilarious scene when Cleopatra and Augustus finally meet. And Augustus literally says to her, I quote, "Your African sorcery failed you this time." This is insane on several different levels, not only because Augustus obviously never believed that Cleopatra was a sorceress, and also Egypt wasn't in Africa. This is something that the showrunners ignore completely or possibly unaware of. The name of the continent was derived from the Roman province of Africa much later. And there were more than one, but that's a different story. And Africa was more or less in the western part of Libya. Not the present day Libya, again. The region known as Libya, from which the name of the modern country is derived from. Cleopatra, by the way, starts this conversation with Augustus with the phrase, "You are a lot shorter than I thought you'd be." And she delivers it with a condescending smile. She actually comes off as a genuinely arrogant and extremely toxic person in this miniseries. The screenwriters believe that's how powerful female characters act. Basically, this line of thinking that absolutely everything directed against a woman is misogyny and men hate women because they are women and they do it all the time, that's just insanity. And this line of thinking is apparently called feminism in modern Hollywood. I'm starting to believe that the real agenda of radical feminists is discreditation of feminism and an attempt of sowing discord between men and women, which was probably kind of true for some early suffragettes, actually, who apparently were used, at least in Britain, as a tool to create a climate where you can easily evade granting the right to vote for another decade or two. What is also interesting is that the screenwriters don't stay consistent and sometimes, quite often actually, simply contradict themselves, which could be okay if they present several mutually exclusive theories. But they don't. It is just bad writing and bad editing. Basically, first they accuse everyone of hating Cleopatra because of her gender, and then suddenly they acknowledge that, well, Rome was a republic, and there was some politics involved. They openly say how Cleopatra made plans for her son Ptolemy Caesar to kind of become the ruler of both Rome and Egypt, and then act surprised when somebody in Rome is not crazy about this idea of a foreign monarch. Politics. As you might expect, the political aspect gets dumbed down, which is a thing that people traditionally do when they are working on a product intended for the mass audience. That said, since it is a documentary, you cannot help but expect the authors to be grown-ups and dissect the political aspect as grown-ups. And yes, the politics of both Rome and Egypt at the time was very complicated and very deceptive. Nobody really knows the inner workings of the politics of the court in Alexandria at the time. You can have theories, and these theories might elevate your material to a completely different level. The screenwriters have their moments and occasionally make right choices, but then again, they don't really want to go into the details and construct plausible theories. Plus, as I said, they frequently contradict themselves. It is very good that they decided to tone down all of these romantic stories about Cleopatra and her men. So there are no carpets with Cleopatra hiding inside, no asps biting the queen, stories about her letter to Mark Antony. Very reasonable, that's just unnecessary theatrics. I wish they could get rid of some other theatrics as well. They say stuff like Shakespeare would have us believe Cleopatra fabricated her own suicide. Well, it's not entirely Shakespeare, it is Plutarch. But yes, downplaying episodes like this is a smart choice. They're absolutely on point when they say that Cleopatra used her relationships strategically and generally tried to present her as a ruthless and very professional politician. Which is the way to go, the only reasonable way to interpret the material. Cleopatra was an incredible politician. A little bit of a Borgia-style politician, I'd say. I could use the word Machiavellian, but if you read Discourses on Livy, I think you agree that this word is kind of misleading. But they don't make her ruthless enough in the miniseries, and since they are constantly dumbing down the political aspect and cannot maintain consistency of the script, it all degrades quite quickly. First, she is ruthless, then she speaks of honor and how you can't abandon allies in the time of need. They actually have an episode when Octavian accuses Cleopatra of providing financial aid to Brutus and Cassius, which, yes, he did. This episode alone leaves a lot of room for speculation of what was going on behind the scenes and advance a couple of interesting and challenging theories. Theories that she did, in fact, bankroll both parties in the Civil War, and probably even in the next Civil War. This is the textbook behavior of the leader of the state, especially a very rich state. Foreign policy 101. Good politicians like to bet on all of the horses simultaneously. They do it up to this day. The conflict in the neighboring countries, and especially the civil war, is an opportunity for everyone around. They should have elaborated more on the subject, but they obviously didn't. While presenting Rome as something inherently evil, they try to explain, without much success, how great Egypt was. They mentioned that it was a grain basket and an ancient civilization, but ruin stuff with phrases like Egypt's relationship to Rome is basically that of a poor cousin. Yeah, at certain points you can make this kind of assumption, but it is very misleading and contradictory. They could have bad years due to the nature of the agriculture centered around the Nile, but in the end, Egypt was an agricultural superpower. They had money and they had an army. Alexandria was the largest and the most advanced city in the Mediterranean and arguably in the world, and a cultural center of Greek culture. Somehow, in the miniseries, it is usually depicted as a rundown Middle Eastern fort somewhere in the desert. This importance of Alexandria is completely overlooked, just like the fact that it was a Greek city. They kind of assume the court of Alexandria consisted mostly of African Americans. Once again, since they don't mention that their society was divided, in many ways even segregated, it just paints an incredibly distorted picture. Alexandria was even referred back in the day as something like Alexandria near Egypt, meaning that Egypt begins when you leave the city. Alexandria wasn't really in Egypt at all. And all of the screenwriters' ideas and their agenda about how Romans ruined everything and how Cleopatra was a true Egyptian pharaoh, and yada 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 yada, can go straight into the garbage pile. For example, they say stuff like, there were three primary populations in Egypt as a whole. We have the native Egyptians, we have the Greek peoples who came in with the Ptolemies, and we also have a very sizable Jewish population. But they all were united in the fact that they didn't like Rome. What the hell is this? Is this documentary? They even decided to mention Jews because, well, how can you have a conversation about Egypt without mentioning Jews? They should have mentioned Christians as well, why not? They never, under any circumstances, mention some other ethnic groups like Nubians, by the way. And they refuse to acknowledge that Greeks and native Egyptians were not as unified as they like to imagine. The fall of Cleopatra is accompanied by, well, wild ramblings like Egypt's long history as a great civilization ends, Rome impoverished Egypt, Cleopatra is the last pharaoh of Egypt. Well, Egypt's history doesn't end there. All the stories of how Rome impoverished Egypt are highly debatable. They did pretty much the same stuff as everybody before them. Actually, for the majority of Egyptians, the Roman rule was just, now we are under a new management. You can say that they were essentially robbing an average Egyptian guy and making profits, but the Ptolemaic dynasty did absolutely the same. And the Ptolemaic dynasty was a foreign dynasty, and there were Persians before them. Egypt was ruled by the foreign management for centuries. And their modus operandi was pretty much analogous to that of the native Egyptian pharaohs. The Persian, the Greek, or the Roman regimes were doing mostly the same stuff. They were a bit removed from the life of an average Egyptian, and they used all the traditional management tools and employed the same Egyptian priests who allowed them to control the country. What is funny, they like to show how Cleopatra mentions like every 10 minutes that she was Isis, and then it culminates when she tells a Roman that I am a god, do not disrespect me, which is absolutely mental. The screenwriters don't understand or choose to ignore how the Ptolemaic monarchs presented themselves to Egyptians and how they presented themselves to Greeks and Hellenized people. Yes, they were god kings for Egyptians. That's a traditional thing. I think that Egyptians understood one of the most important aspects of their religion and one of the tools for control. But for the Greek and Macedonian subjects in Alexandria, or for the fellow Greeks everywhere, including Hellenic rulers, for them, they were enlightened Greek kings. A Greek king or a Greek elected official cannot run around and scream, I'm a god, not to his, peers. Romans later employed the same tactics, and, not only Romans. Charles III, the current British monarch, sent his portrait to a tribe in Vanuatu. This tribe considers his late father a god, and it is expected that Charles III is going to be their new god. But if Charles starts telling British people that he's in fact their god as well, his family might consider sending him to a mental health institution. This idea of a god king is a very important one. The miniseries mentions that, ironically, like Cleopatra before, Octavian is elevated as a living god. They should have elaborated more on the subject, because this creation of the cult of the God Emperor was probably not a coincidence at all. Augustus essentially just copied the Ptolemaic model after he took control of Egypt and became its pharaoh. There is even this joke slash theory that it was not really Rome that absorbed Egypt, but in a way it was Egypt that absorbed Rome. And yes, obviously, Cleopatra wasn't the last pharaoh of Egypt. Technically, she wasn't even the last Ptolemaic pharaoh. The last one was Ptolemy Caesar, her son, who was succeeded by Augustus. Roman emperors were pharaohs and were depicted as ones in Egypt. The most interesting aspect here is how Augustus managed to pull off this gambit of integrating Egypt into Rome, considering that Egypt was practically a superpower, and how this integration made Egypt basically his personal domain where he was a monarch. That's one hell of a subject for speculations and theories. Okay, we should really wrap this all up. As I've mentioned, we can talk about all of this for hours, but I don't have a goal of talking about all of the problems and all of the mistakes in Queen Cleopatra miniseries. And there are lots of them. People wear strange clothes, Romans wear beards, Mark Antony is presented as, I quote, essentially a commoner who's risen through the ranks. They kind of credit Caesar's reform of calendar to Cleopatra. Cleopatra is presented as a scientist. That's just hopeless. Cleopatra was a very important political figure, more important than people usually imagine, because they are blinded by all these romantic stories and movie adaptations. And Cleopatra deserves better than what they show and tell in this horrible pseudo-documentary. Come on, even Gaius Caligula in Commodus deserve better. The curious thing with these Netflix documentaries, rewriting history according to their needs and their agenda and completely ignoring the sources, is, the thing is, they are not the only ones. It's been done long before Netflix emerged. It's been done before the invention of cinema and before the invention of the printing press. This is how history is written. And one of the reasons why revisionism is important is because you can get to the bottom of something new when you operate with new data, common sense, and careful analysis of the sources. And some of the sources sometimes have the same quality as Queen Cleopatra miniseries. They make stuff up and they falsify history, like Eusebius or Historia Augusta. People are wrong when they say that Netflix engages in historical revisionism. This is not revisionism. This is just falsification and insulting propaganda, performed by people who are clearly not qualified even for this questionable task. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.